God trying to thrust me into the abyss of darkness and despair and hopelessness. But then I turn upon God and I thrust God into the abyss. And now I am free. And Jan and I were just horrified. I'd never heard anything so demonic in my life. And yet, this is what this supposedly Christian theologian was reduced to deal with the problem of sin.
Dr. William Lane Craig, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Actually, we did meet. I told you before we started. We met briefly at an Apologetics conference in Denton, Texas, at Denton Bible Church many, many years ago. You sat in front of me, you spoke, and I introduced myself. So it's great to have you here in person. I want you to do most of the talking today, but I did want to share a little bit of my story, which I don't think I've ever told my testimony on this podcast or the other one, at least kind of a brief version of that, which intersects with your work, and I want to set that up for the audience of even why I had you on here. But I'm 46 now. 20 years ago, I'm 26 years old, and I've been married for 3 or 4 years, had a couple beautiful children. I just got a great job. I got a pay raise, new house, and one night I woke up about 2 a.m. in the morning, and I just felt this overwhelming sense of despair. And it had been building, so it wasn't something that like happened in a moment, but it had been building and building and building. And I wake up and I just feel something that is over me that I can't quite describe. I look at my beautiful wife, who's amazing, and I just feel despair. I walk into the bedroom of my children and I see them, and I'd prayed for this moment. I'd prayed for this life that I finally had. And what I felt was really despair. Because I did not really know if the faith that I had been a part of for so long was true, and that I could know it to be true. And it was crippling for me. And I went into my office and I wrote down a letter to God, which I had only done once in my life before that. And I mean, because I'm teaching Bible class at church, I mean, I'm like doing the thing you're supposed to do. And I wrote this letter, and the letter simply said, God, if you're there, which I doubt, and if you answer prayers, which I also doubt, I'm drowning and I need help. And I'm weeping, and the tears are literally hitting the ink on the paper and spreading the ink. And I fold this piece of paper up and I put it in my desk drawer. I found it 5 years later and was like, oh my goodness, God is so good at what he did. But shortly after that, my dad, who was a pastor, a campus pastor at University of Louisiana Monroe, college students, got invited to a debate. And the debate was on, was God a moral monster? Talking about the extermination of the Canaanites and all the problem of evil and whatnot. And he agreed to do the debate with the college student who was an atheist. And rhetorically, I thought he did a great job. Logically, I thought he got destroyed, and it really shook my faith. You see your dad up there, and I love my dad. That's an awesome man. But he was not prepared. This guy, I felt like he had so many points that I thought, man, he makes a good point. I started to interact with this gentleman on Facebook, and everything that I would say to him, the atheist, he would respond, well, that's a circumstantial ad hominem fallacy. That's a red herring fallacy. And I would cite my source, and he eventually said, you would not know a fallacy if it crawled out of a certain part of my body and made me breakfast. And I thought, maybe I don't know what a fallacy is. So I Google, well, it's what you do, right? I Google, what is fallacy? And this page pops up, 42 Aristotelian logical fallacies. And I start reading them, and I'm like, oh my goodness, somebody's like taking my toolbox and how I communicate and decoded it. So I was like so convicted. Well, that got me into a vortex of the YouTube, Google algorithms, and I wound up on YouTube watching a debate between a Christian and an atheist. I can't remember the atheist's name. I do remember the Christian's name because it was Dr. William Lane Craig. It was you. And I did not know what you were talking about, but I knew you were winning the debate. And so I said, I'm going to order this guy's book. And I ordered a book that you wrote called Reasonable Faith, which I'm not a reader. And I wasn't then, at least. I am now. That was the first apologetics book that I read, and it was very difficult to get through because of a lot of big terms like eschatology, like epistemology, like existentialism, historicity, spurious. quantum mechanics. But
You
that
jumped in at the deep end.
I did, but it was so life-changing for me, and then for several years, I went through your systematic theology, course that you teach at, is it what church is it, Johnson Ferry?
Defenders.
Yes. I did all of those over the course of probably a year and a half, and
Wow.
I mean, so I wanna thank you because I can't tell you, like, 5 years later, I found that letter, and I went from questioning, I don't believe this is true. Maybe I had Pascal's wagers faith, of hoping it was true, but I went from that to being sure that the claims of the Bible were absolutely true, and you
Wow.
were my entry point into that, so thank you, Dr. Craig.
Praise the Lord.
It is a blessing to have you on the podcast. With that, I want to open up with a question that we get more as a criticism almost in every single episode that we've done, just on this podcast, but on the other. And there's a lot of people that disagree with this, but it is something that I want to lay out first before we get into this. One of the criticisms that we get when we get into some of the discussions around apologetics, theology, philosophy, is that Jesus kept it simple, and you guys are going too deep. Just keep it simple. Have you interacted with that type of criticism before? Because your work is very complex. It is simple in some regards, but it's also very complex. How do you interact with the statement or that criticism about apologetics, philosophy, and theology?
Yes. I like to differentiate between what I call a childlike faith and a childish faith. Jesus commended to us a childlike faith, that is to say, a whole souled repose in God and in his love. And that is the kind of confident repose that our faith should have. But a childish faith is an unreflective faith, a brain dead faith, a faith that doesn't inquire or ask questions. And that kind of faith is not commended to us in the Bible. On the contrary, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14, do not be children in your thinking. Be babes in evil, but in thinking be mature. And so I think that it is part of Christian maturity to reflect deeply upon the revelation that God has given us in Christ so that we can understand it more accurately. And this will in turn augment our worship of God as we come to have a greater vision of his majesty and greatness. So it will be spiritually nourishing as well as intellectually nourishing.
And that was the case for me, for sure. When I interacted with your work for the first time, because I'd always understood faith, and partly because of the way I was taught, and when I would bring my objections to pastors, faith was the leap into the unknown, and that's how I always viewed it. You helped me see that faith is anchored in something that's knowable, which is the title of your whole ministry, right? Reasonable faith. How did you?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
talk about that a little bit. How you came up with because these two things seemed like they're contradictory.
Well, that's a little bit funny. I originally wrote the book you mentioned, Reasonable Faith, as an introduction to apologetics for my seminary course that I was teaching at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. I thought I would publish my lectures so that students wouldn't have to take notes on everything I said. And when Crossway published the book, they decided to call it Reasonable Faith. And I didn't like that title at all. I thought that sounded like warmed over oatmeal. I had no idea how provocative and controversial a title like Reasonable Faith would be. And so I owe it to the publishers for the selection of that title to the book and then the name of the ministry that we have that derives from that signature book.
And now you've written quite a few books, which I've read a lot of them, and some of them are real brain benders. I read one that you wrote called "The Only Wise God," which was a real brain bender for me. But talking about time and how God's foreknowledge. But you've gone on to do great things. So you also pointed me to another philosopher who and I don't know when you said this or where you said it, but you said he was the greatest Christian uh, philosopher living, and he was at the University of Notre Dame,
Yes.
Dr. Alvin Plantinga. And it's interesting because I was interacting with your work, and so I go to my mother, who is she's gone on to be the Lord, but she was a titan of the faith, and just loved Jesus with all of her heart, read her Bible every day, and I asked her, "What is the greatest evidence that you see for the existence of God and the validity of Christ? Like, how do you know that God is real, Mom? How do you know it to be true?" And she said something to the effect of, I don't know, Zach. I look outside my window. I see the birds chirping on the branch of the oak tree out in front of the house. I see the river. They lived on a river streaming by. I hear the wind blowing, and it just kind of makes sense that God is there. And I thought, Mom, it's got to be more than that. Got to be more than that. And the very next day, I see a question that was asked on YouTube or some podcast of Dr. Plantinga that asked him he gives the greatest reason for the existence of a God of all the arguments that he's constructed, and you pointed me to another article that he had written. I think it was called
Yes.
2 dozen or so
Two
arguments.
dozen or so arguments for the
Yeah,
existence of God. It's become legendary.
which you've written a lot on that, like the cosmological argument, the moral argument, the ontological argument. So he goes through a lot of those. So which one's the greatest? And the interviewer is asking him that question, and and I'm probably going to butcher this, but he said something to the effect of, "I look outside my window and I see the river in front of my house. I hear the birds chirping. I see the squirrels running around in the yard, and I don't know, it just kind of makes sense." And I was like, so there is a simplicity of it, like God does reveal
Yes.
Himself. Um, but he's inexhaustible.
What Plantinga did was give a sophisticated philosophical defense of your grandmother's view that belief in God is a properly basic belief that is formed in the context of certain experiences, and so is part of the deliverances of reason, even if it is not a conclusion that is inferred by arguments. And so I think there are two basic ways of knowing the truth of God's existence and the truth of Christianity. One would be what we might call the interior way, which is through that inner immediate experience of God. And then the other is the exterior way, which will consist of philosophical arguments and historical evidences.
Yeah, that's good. When you use a term there, properly basic belief, can you define when you said you use that term,
Yes,
define that for the audience?
um, a properly basic belief will be a belief that is part of the foundations of a person's system of beliefs. It's not believed on the basis of some more deeply lying belief. It's not inferred from some other belief. And it's proper in the sense that it is grounded in certain experiences. So, for example, when I look out the window and I form the belief, there is a tree, I do not reason that the best explanation for these tree-like experiences that I'm having is that there's a physical object out there off of which photons are reflecting and entering into my eyeballs and striking the retina so that I form the image of a tree and conclude that there is a tree. No, I immediately form the belief there is a tree in the context of being appeared to in this tree-like way. And so what Plantinga says is that really most of our beliefs, when you think about it, are properly basic beliefs that are grounded in our experience. And we are perfectly rational in holding to these sorts of beliefs unless and until we have some overriding defeater of those beliefs, something that would make us think that that belief is in fact false.
That's such a great point. When you think about properly basic beliefs, and could you say it this way, that these are beliefs that we hold that may not necessarily have a justification for why we hold them?
No, I think this is really important to understand, Zach. Plantinga would deny that his epistemology or theory of knowledge is in any way fideistic, like that blind leap of faith in the dark that you talk about. And that was why I emphasized that these properly basic beliefs are themselves part of the deliverances of reason. These are justified beliefs, but they're not justified on the basis of argument. They are part of the very foundations of a person's system of beliefs, and they are warranted by being formed by our cognitive faculties, which are functioning properly in the environment in which God created us. And so Plantinga gives a whole theory of knowledge to show how these properly basic beliefs can be not just properly basic, but actually warranted and therefore knowledge. So these are justified beliefs. These are knowledge, and they are part of the deliverances of reason.
How do you see reason and then desire working together?
I haven't done a lot of reflection on this personally. In his theory of knowledge, Plantinga has some really interesting sections about the corruption of our cognitive faculties that is the result of sin. And one of these corruptions that he talks about is a distortion of our desires, a distortion of our will, where instead of desiring God as we were created to, we desire lesser goods in the place of God, and therefore our desires are warped. And these kinds of warped desires can cause a person to malfunction cognitively so that he believes falsehoods. In fact, Plantinga says, interestingly enough, it is possible to induce a person from rationality to irrationality by presenting him a valid argument based on premises that he knows to be true.
Oh, wow.
So that because of his distorted desires, he denies one of those premises in order to hang on to that conclusion he wants to believe. And so for Plantinga, atheists are literally cognitively dysfunctional. Their rational faculties are not functioning properly as God designed them to. And part of the reason for that will be the effects of sin upon our inherent desires.
For you and your work, and you've done a construction on quite a few arguments. For you, what's the greatest argument that you would appeal to if someone were to ask you, what's the greatest argument for his existence?
Well, of the various arguments for God's existence, I've defended around 6 that I think are sound and persuasive. But my favorite is the so-called Kalam cosmological argument, on which I wrote my doctoral thesis in Great Britain. This argument has a very simple structure. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. And here you can bring powerful philosophical and scientific evidence in support of that second premise, which then leads to the conclusion 3, therefore, a cause of the universe exists. And then you unpack what it is to be a cause of the universe, and a striking number of divine attributes of this cause can be recovered. It turns out that this argument implies the existence of an absolutely first, beginningless, uncaused, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe. And that is, I think, the core concept of God.
And so if someone comes to you and says an objection on the first premise, which was whatever begins to exist must have a cause, and I've heard this before, and I think I know what you're going to say, but how do you respond when they say, well, what about God? What created God? What if anything?
Yeah, that's based on a misunderstanding, Zach. The first premise does not say everything that exists has a cause. It says everything that begins to exist has a cause. The idea is that anything that comes into being must have a cause. Being does not come from non-being. Things don't pop into existence uncaused out of nothing. So a thing that is uncaused would have to be eternal and beginningless. And that's why this argument leads to the existence of an absolutely first beginningless, uncaused cause.
Is this what Aristotle had in mind with his unmovable object, would you say?
Aristotle had an argument for God as the uncaused cause, but Aristotle was thinking of God as being the first uncaused cause in the sense of rank rather than in a temporal sense. For Aristotle, he was quite willing to admit that as you go back in time, the universe just goes back and back and back without a beginning. But in terms of rank, he thought there were higher and higher and higher causes acting simultaneously to produce some effect, and that this sort of series of causes cannot be beginningless. Rather, there must be a first uncaused cause, which is at the summit of that series of simultaneous, hierarchically ranked causes. So that would be the Aristotelian concept of a first uncaused cause.
So where did you get the name Kalam from? The cosmological I get, but what about tell me about the word Kalam.
Well, what I discovered as I began to research the history of this argument is that although the argument originated in Christian philosophy with a commentator in Alexandria, Egypt, on Aristotle named John Philoponus, when Islam swept over Egypt in the 7th century, it absorbed the tradition of this argumentation. And in medieval Islam, this argument came to be highly developed and very sophisticated. And then eventually it was passed back to the Latin-speaking Western Christian theologians through the intermediary of Jewish theologians who lived side by side with Muslim theologians in Spain when Spain was controlled by the Caliphate. And so this argument originated in Christianity. It was developed by Muslims and Jews and then given back to the Christian West again. And so to honor that medieval Islamic contribution to the argument, I picked the Arabic word kalam. And kalam in medieval Arabic designates Islamic theology. Kalam is basically a statement of doctrine in medieval Islam. And so in light of their contribution, I thought it would appropriate to call this the Kalam cosmological argument. And the name seems to have stuck.
Yeah, and so it's not an argument for Christ. It's just an argument for God, for this necessary being. Correct?
Exactly. This is an argument that has great intersectarian appeal. As I say, it's been propounded by Muslims, by Jews, and by Christians, both Catholic and Protestant. It leads to the idea of this personal creator of the universe, which all of the great monotheistic faiths affirm. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exclude a lot of religions, because what that excludes is things like materialism, atheism, polytheism, all forms of pantheism like Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism. It basically restricts the field of the world's great religions to those monotheistic faiths. And then to decide whether or not this God is the Christian God or not, you need to look at the person of Jesus of Nazareth and ask who he was. So the Kalam cosmological argument is an argument for the existence of God, which is very broad in its intersectarian appeal. And I'll tell you, Zach, this has been a wonderful bridge builder to Muslim evangelism. Muslims love my work, and it is an automatic in to talk to Muslims about these things, and the conversation inevitably leads to Jesus Christ. So it's really a wonderful bridge builder to use with Muslims.
So to that point, where do you then go if we've established, hey, there is a God? Now, who is he? And
Exactly.
where do
Who
you go
is
from
the
there?
creator of the universe? Has he remained aloof and distant from the world that he's made? Or has he revealed himself to us in some further
Mm,
way
yeah.
that we might know him more closely? And of course, all of these faiths claim to have some sort of special revelation from God, which then needs to be rationally assessed.
And where do you go with Christ? Is it centered around the resurrection? Is that where you head to the historicity of the
It is
resurrection?
for me, yes. I did my doctoral work in theology following the completion of my doctoral work in philosophy in England in Germany, working with Wolfhard Pannenberg at the University of Munich. Pannenberg had rocked German theology by defending the resurrection of Jesus historically. And so for 2 years, I worked under him in Munich, developing a case for the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. And I was shocked. Honestly, I did not expect this. I was shocked to discover that by far and away, the wide majority of New Testament historians who have written on the historical Jesus and what happened to him agree with the fundamental facts that undergird the inference to Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Things like the discovery of his empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus to various individuals and groups, and the very origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. So those facts are all well established in New Testament scholarship, and the only question really is, what's the best explanation for those facts? And I'm convinced that the best explanation is the one that the original disciples
Yeah.
gave, namely, God raised Jesus from the dead.
When you use the term New Testament scholarship, I think it's helpful. Like, does this encompass non-believers of Jesus in that scholarship, or are you talk about that a little bit for the audience?
Yes, when I use that term, I'm talking about the broad spectrum of professional New Testament historians who teach at liberal schools and secular schools, as well as conservative schools, or who aren't even Christian. I mean, it's remarkable, for example, the Jewish scholars who have an interest in Jesus, like Pinchas Lapid and Geza Vermash, have argued for the historicity of the discovery of Jesus' empty tomb by the women on the first day of the week after his crucifixion. So these are not simply the conclusions of conservative scholars. These are the conclusions of the wide majority of all
Yeah.
professional New Testament scholars.
So they, in other words, they may not agree with the final conclusion that Jesus was raised from the dead, but they would agree the tomb was empty. The early disciples thought they had an experience of the risen Jesus. These are things they would agree on, correct?
Yes, and that they came to believe that God raised him from the dead. So they will agree on those basic facts. And then those who do not want to believe in the resurrection at that point typically don't offer a counter explanation. Rather, what they simply do is shrug their shoulders and say, we don't know what happened. Something dramatic, something life changing happened in the lives of these men, but who knows what it
Yeah.
was.
Yeah, I found your work on this to be extremely helpful, and for me, one of the things that I've come to that I think I don't know if this has ever been written about or whatever. I just call it like the ultimate apologetic, and this is just for me, is that as I've explored kind of my own life, and there is this glaring problem that I have called sin that everything else that I've looked into, there's just no provision for that sin. There's just
Mm.
nothing there that speaks to there's no
Oh,
atonement available. There's not in all these other systems, and it's either bootstrap yourself up, which I can't do, or it's pretend like it's not there, but I know that it is there. So for me,
yes.
it's been that's been a big part of. I don't know if there's an apologetic around that, but it's like just the provision of sin itself, just the story of what Christ did and His atonement has been one of the greatest evidences
Yeah.
for
I,
Christ.
I completely agree with you, Zach. I remember I had a debate with Gert Ludemann at Boston College. Ludemann it was a prominent New Testament scholar in Germany who wrote on the resurrection of Jesus and tried to explain away the postmortem appearance of Jesus as hallucinations on the part of the disciples that were brought on by a guilt complex that Peter had for having denied Jesus. And we had this debate at Boston College on whether the resurrection was historical or not. And at the breakfast in the refectory the next morning, my wife Jan, who was with me, said to Ludemann across the breakfast table, "What do you do about sin in your life?"
Mm.
And Ludemann said, "I go to therapy." And we said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she says, and he said, I go to a therapist who helps me to deal with my sin and guilt. And Jan said, "Well, what does he do?" And he said, "He induces visions in me." And we said, "Like what?" And he said, "Well, I have this one vision of God trying to thrust me into the abyss of darkness and despair and hopelessness. But then I turn upon God and I thrust God into the abyss.
Mm.
And now I am free." And Jan and I were just horrified. I'd never heard anything so demonic in my life. And yet, this is what this supposedly Christian theologian was reduced to deal with the problem of sin.
Mm. Wow, that's it's amazing the lengths that we'll go to avoid this reality. When I started with your work, would you say that your apologetics is like evidential apologetics, natural theology? Is that how you would categorize what your work has been?
I would, although that needs to be carefully explained because the word evidentialism in apologetics is often used to say that faith in the absence of arguments is irrational. And I do not agree with that. As we said before, there are certain properly basic beliefs that we all hold to and are perfectly rational in doing so, even though they're not based on arguments. Things like belief in the reality of the external world or belief in the reality of past events. And so I'm not an evidentialist in that sense, but I do believe that there are good evidentiary arguments that support the existence of God and the historicity of Jesus' resurrection.
Have you interacted a lot in the presuppositional world, which would be the apologetic that presupposes certain things to be true? And
Only a very little bit. There was a view, a book published several years ago by Steve Cowan called Five Views on Apologetics. And it included a presuppositionalist like John Frame. And I was one of the contributors and interacted with him there. But quite honestly, outside of your Christian evangelical circles, presuppositionalism is really an irrelevance. It is of no great significance today. And so it's really a tempest in a teapot.
have you thought about the role that beauty plays in apologetics? I mean, sometimes it seems apologetics can be very like it's more in the brain, right, and in the intellect. But how does it correlate to the role of beauty in the Christian life?
I have not considered this. I would very much like to, but I have never looked into aesthetics before. I've done work in ethics about moral goods, but I've never looked at aesthetic goods. And I think that you're right that we want to say that God is the source of all good. He is the supreme good. And so he's the fount of everything that's good. And that would include aesthetic values like beauty, as well as moral values like love or justice. So this is an underexplored area. If there are any of our listeners who are students and want to go on in the area of philosophy or apologetics, this would make a great doctoral dissertation, would be examining arguments for God from aesthetic value or beauty.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're our little church here. We're up here in Asheville, North Carolina, which is a very
Oh,
it's kind of a post-Christian culture. It's kind of weird because you got Billy Graham and like a Presbyterian hub here, but you also have a lot of New Age mysticism, Buddhism,
oh,
Wiccan culture that has moved in. So it's kind of a weird. It's a very spiritual city. I wouldn't, but what we've witnessed in our church is a lot of these people are coming to know Christ for the first time. There's one particular gentleman that I met with last night that he was telling me, he said, "Yeah, I got to the end of my worldview, and I ended with finding Jesus at the end of it all. I pursued all the things you mentioned earlier, Buddhism. I think he started off. He said, I said, how would you categorize yourself like back in the you know mid '90s, mid 2000s? He said I was probably like a Richard Dawkins type, and but he left that and then went into
wow.
some of the mysticisms, but he tried everything. But it was the beauty of who God was that drew him in ultimately. And I thought, man, that's such an interesting area to explore. And it
Yes.
reminded me of I read a book by James K.A. Smith called Desiring the Kingdom. And one of the
Mm,
points that he makes in the book is that historically, he argues that we were primarily seen from a Cartesian worldview as thinking machines. And then he argues the Reformation led us to be primarily believing beings, but he argues that we're primarily liturgical or religious beings, which he defines as worshipers. And at your core, what you are is a being that has desire, affections. You are a worshiper at your core, and so the role of the apologetic or spiritual formation is to form the desire in your heart to properly index that desire towards the triune God. And when that
yeah.
lines up with who he is, he argues that that's where true freedom is found. And I found that to be very compelling and almost kind of like a companion to the apologetics that I've studied over the years.
Yes. Yes, that sounds very helpful. It's just not an area in which I've worked.
So, well, I want to thank you for coming on today. I think that our audience, I want them to interact with your work. You've also written a book that's I won't call it a layman's version, but it's certainly a more accessible version of Reasonable Faith. And the name of that book is On Guard.
Yes.
And I think there may be a study guide with that. Is that correct?
Yes, there is. And I would encourage people not to start with reasonable faith. As I say, this was originally developed as a seminary textbook for graduate students. The book, if you're a beginner, that you want to start with is the book On Guard. And that will give you arguments for the existence of God and the resurrection of Jesus, as well as answers to the most important objections. It's like a kind of Swiss Army knife that you can use for all sorts of things. So that would be the one book of mine that I would recommend to the beginner.
Yeah, so if you're listening and you have maybe struggled with believing that Christianity is an intellectually viable option, which I think your work if is proven that it is intellectually viable, and actually where you led me to believe was that it's more probable, even beyond just viability. It's this, I mean, your case that you make in all of your arguments, the five or six that you've worked on, um, they're very compelling, and to the
Well,
point.
I'm glad you think so, Zach. I find them really convincing. When I have a debate with an atheist on a campus, I come away from that thinking about the debate, thinking about the arguments, and sometimes I reflect to myself, these arguments are really good.
Yeah, they are.
I'm convinced by them.
It's interesting when I'd watch your debates and all of your debates. I mean, your script it's like the argument's there. There's no element of surprise. I mean, they can research the argument before in advance, and it's that iron tight that airtight. It's just it stands on its own. The work is there, the truth
Yeah.
is there, and I just think it speaks to the greatness of our God that He's just unavoidable. I mean, we cannot even on like in epistemology. I talked about this quite a bit that even to prove that God is not there, I have to reach up onto His shelf to borrow rationality and bring it back down into the material world to prove
Yeah.
that the spiritual world is not there. I mean, He's just unavoidable. And so your work has been so encouraging for me because I was thinking, all you have to do, if your work can be defeated, it would have been defeated by now. But it hasn't, and I believe because what you have been doing is obviously speaking on behalf of the Lord, and I want to thank you again for joining us. Thank you so much for your ministry and what you've done to help so many people like me.
Well, it's a joy and a pleasure to have been with you this morning, Zach. Thank you.